Hello and welcome to another tutorial. So this time around we're going to be talking about an area known as version control. Now version control is a gigantic area. There's a lot of things related to this. So my goal with this is to cover sort of the essentials, to give you an idea of what version control is, to convince you hopefully of why you should use it and how it will benefit you, and to give you a little bit of a intro of sort of some general processes of how you set it up and how you actually can work with it. So that's sort of the goal there. So there's not going to be sort of any code, things like that we're writing. It's really just going to be getting a few sort of things set up. So to begin with, just sort of an idea of what version control is and why you should use it. So at its simplest, version control does a number of things for us. It allows us to take a bundle of changes that we might have made for working on a particular feature. We can group that up, provide a description for it, and then we do what's called committing or checking it in. And so our project becomes built up via these streams of commits and check-ins. And the advantage to that is a few things. One thing, it keeps work for particular areas very self-contained. So if something goes wrong, we can narrow it down to a particular change that went in, and that lets us find and fix issues much more readily. Also means if we needed to back that change out to undo it, that's often an easier process if we've got things in nice self-contained changes. It can be easier to track down problem ones because that description is going to give us the information as far as what's actually contained in there. And the tools usually let us see specifically things like what code or stuff like that was actually changed. So they're very handy for being able to, have stability in our projects there. But the big benefit is because generally when we're using version control, you want to be using that with it connected to a server. And what that allows is then multiple people can work on the same project very easily. It gives you a way of distributing that project, the code and your content for it, to everyone that's working on it. And when someone makes a change, then everyone else can easily get that same change. And then we can go further from that, because when we actually make changes, we can set up stuff called continuous integration. So we can have build tools that might be running automated tests. So if we go and make some changes, we can then run validation tests on those changes to make sure that we haven't broken anything, and if we can set up regression tests for previous issues, so it can be really handy for maintaining stability there. We can also run tests in terms of performance. We can run tests in terms of just doing various builds, making sure it builds for every platform. There's a lot of automation that we can do there. And this is something that you'll find in pretty much any sort of studio of fairly small size and up. It's very standard to have automated processes like that. A lot of the places I've worked at, there's automation there that'll build, it'll test it on every platform. It will, even ones where it'll go and play levels and check memory usage throughout playing those levels, check performance, so it can report back if there are sudden degradations in performance so we can go and fix them. It will, do things like going and producing builds and uploading those to platforms like Steam and everything. So there's a lot of things that can be done there with version control is sort of the key enabling thing for us. So it's keeping our changes organized well. It's allowing us to do automation and things like that to ensure stability, to ensure ease of actually providing builds to people. It, with having that server side, gives us a way of having an initial backup for the actual project. I would still, however, absolutely recommend having further backups on top of that. That's something where, okay, having a copy of it locally, having a copy on a server, that's good. That's one backup. Have more. More backups is always a good thing because sometimes things go wrong and you want to avoid that and you want to be able to recover from that if things do go wrong. So lots and lots of backups. So, okay, that's a bunch of things version control helps with. It helps us with quality control and things like that as well, because in most of the tools, there's going to be an easy way to review changes that have been made. And depending upon workflows, things like that, those might be changes where you're reviewing them after they've been checked in, or you might be reviewing them before they get brought across or checked in, depending on particular version control you're using. So again, that process of reviewing changes, it helps with the code quality, and that's always a big win. But the other big benefit for doing code reviews like of that is it's a teaching tool. Code reviews are a way of you build quality, but you also build knowledge and understanding of areas within your team, which is really, really handy. It's a great tool for that. So, okay, we get a lot of improvements that help with our workflows. Also means if we're doing big, large features, most version control systems allow you to basically branch off your project, which then means you've got a isolated area that you can be working on stuff in, and then when it's ready, bring it back across. So there's a lot of things that it benefits our workflow to be able to be using them. Whether you're a small dev or a large dev, I recommend making use of it. Even for small solo projects that I'm doing in a game jam, we always will use version control. It's just a much, much better way of working. It makes your life easier. I cannot possibly reiterate enough times how valuable and how important using version control is. So let's dive on in. So in terms of version control, there are a lot of tools that are out there. There is Unity's version control system, which used to be, I believe, known as Plastic SCM. You have Git, you have Subversion, you have Perforce. There's a lot of different tools out there, systems out there for working with version control. I've used a lot of different ones. The advantages and disadvantages for each do vary. So I'm not going to say which tools you should use because it really depends on your use case. For most of my work, if I'm working in Unity, I'm using Git. For a lot of the large sort of commercial work I do, with that we're using Perforce. But which tools you use, as I said, there are other ones than those, the Unity version control, for example. Which ones you use are really down to you need to look at the features between them. All of the tools are really solid. I do recommend, it's more important that you use a tool than that you find the exact perfect fit, though over time you'll find which ones are going to work better for your sort of workflows and your projects. The same is true of what tools you use to access that version control system. So the ones I'm going to be showing today is, so GitHub is a site that provides Git hosting. That's the one that I distribute all of my tutorials and things like that through. There are also sites like GitLab. There's Bitbucket. There's a few different ones available. You can host your own servers. Similar sort of setups with Perforce. There's similar stuff with the Unity version control. So which you use is really, again, I'm not going to prescribe particular ones. The features I'm going to show are generally going to be there in all of them. The other thing then is the local client you might use. So I'm going to demonstrate this stuff using a client called SourceTree. SourceTree is one that is freely available. There are, again, multiple tools that you can use. Normally, the tools that I use with working with Git, I use a tool called Fork. It is for my use cases, because it's commercial work. It is a paid tool. I prefer it though, just from I like the interface and things like that much better for it. But again, that tool preference is really down to what you feel works best for you. So we've got a project that I've created here, and I want to get this project into version control. Now, there are a lot of different ways that we could go about this. I'm going to show sort of the setup from the point of view of, we've created this project, I need to get it into version control. How do I go about doing that? So the very first thing I do is I actually close Unity. And if I had code that I was working on, I wouldn't close like a Visual Studio, but I would go and make sure I save everything. The reason I close Unity is because, and I do the same thing generally with Unreal, the reason I close Unity is because I want to make sure that any content files, any scenes that I'm working on, everything has been fully saved, because it's quite common for computers to do sort of lazy saving, so they don't go and save things immediately. They save stuff in batches. So when the version control, if it isn't built into the editor, so like if I was using Unity version control and using something integrated in with the editor, that would be different. I wouldn't tend to need to close the editor. But because I'm using an external tool, I want to close the editor. I wouldn't normally close Visual Studio though. So, okay, we've got that. Now I've got the website here where I could create a new repository, and I could do that right now. So I'm going to do that. So for GitHub, now again, the process here is going to vary depending upon which provider you're actually using. So for this particular one, I need to give it a name. So this is going to be VCS Demo 1. Now, whether it's a public or a private repository is an important thing that you want to decide. If it is public, anyone's able to see it. So you want to be very careful what stuff you're actually putting in there, because say you were using a third-party asset that you've purchased or that you don't have a license to redistribute, if you make your repository public, you're inadvertently distributing that asset. You want to be really careful to not do that, because that puts you in breach of license agreements, and there could be a lot of legal issues there. Same applies for any content assets, anything like of that you are including there. Also be very, very, very careful if you have a config file that has login credentials or anything like of that. You want to make sure that you don't inadvertently check that into the repository, because then you could be putting a copy of your credentials there for anyone to be able to access. And I hopefully don't need to explain why that would be a really, really, really bad idea. But I give it a name. In this case, I do want this to be public. Now, there'll be options here in terms of what you initialize ones with. I never select to add in a README file because there's not often a need, and if I am putting one there, I have a standard one that I'm putting in. Now, with adding the gitignore, I generally will not do that because I want to manually add it in. So the cases where you would add a README file or a gitignore or a license, if you haven't actually done any work on the project, if you don't already have any files that you're needing to migrate into the repository, that's when I would initially populate it with things. But when I already have an existing project, which is likely the case that you're mostly going to be heading into, you've got an existing project, now you need to get it into version control. So I don't add in anything. I specifically don't want to initialize the repository with any files. So I can tell it to create it. So that's good. And I'm going to stay on this page for a bit. This does give me some setup guides here, but the actual tools that I'm using will make this easier for me. So we've set up the server side of the repository. We've got our local copy here that has just got our project and everything like of that. We haven't done anything to set it up, and we haven't done anything to create a link between the two. So the actual workflow for this will vary a little bit from tool to tool, but in this case, I want to go create, and I might, no, I can't actually just drag that in there. That would have been really handy if I could have. So I want to track down the folder and select that. So this is the root folder for the project. So that's good. And I know that it's the root one because I've got things like my assets, project settings, etc. there. So I can select that. So I can see that it's ready for creating it. Now it does give me the option here of creating this server side as well. That's pretty common that a lot of the tools will, but I usually am in the habit of creating it on the server side first and then linking the two. So if I go and then do create, now it will tell me that there are already files there, which is fine. So what I'll typically see after I've just created that is, and this is very Git specific in terms of terminology, I'll have an area showing me staged files and I'll have unstaged. And at the moment, I have 13,713, and a lot of these are in this library folder. So one of the things with version control is there's a lot of files that our projects generate that are temporary that we don't actually want in the repository. Things like the library folder is one that should never, ever be in the repository. So what we want to do is we want to actually automatically make it filter out those particular files. And every version control tool will have a mechanism for doing this. So GitHub does have a mechanism for doing this. It's a gitignore file that we can set up in the particular folder. So it goes at the top level of the repository. Now I can, if there's individual files here, I can usually select them and tell them to be ignored. But for things like Unity projects, stuff like of that, there's actually standard sets of ones that we can make use of. And what I'll do is I'll bring this over. On GitHub itself, it has a whole bunch of these ignore files, depending upon what you're using. The other site that's actually really useful is gitignore.io tool. And I'll put a link to this in the description, because what this lets you do, as you can see here, you can just type in what tools you're using and go create, and this will give me back a gitignore file that I can then make use of. So in this case, I am using Unity. I'm using Visual Studio. I go create and I get this file. What I do then is I select all of that, copy it, and then there's a couple of ways I can go about actually setting up this gitignore file. Really depends upon how you're wanting to work with it. I usually do this by just creating a file here manually myself called .gitignore, and then I would load that in, let's go for Notepad, and then I just paste all of that in and save that. And then when I go back to SourceTree, it should update and it's gone from 13,700 odd to 24 files, which is much more reasonable. That's what we actually would expect it more to be. So that's good. What we then do, our general sort of workflow process, is when we are submitting these files, we stage them. So you can see they're now staged. And then I would provide a message. So set up initial project. I can commit that. So depending upon the particular tool you're using, the terminology might be different, but it'll usually be either commit or check-in. So, okay, that's good. But if I go and take a look at this repository, it's still just this page. It's still just empty. That's because I haven't actually connected the two. So what I can do for connecting them is it has this origin, and this is what it's after. Now, the setup here is done via command line, but I can do this via the tool. So this is what's called in Git, you're adding a remote. So I can copy that URL, which is the same as the URL here. I can go to the tool here, and under remotes, I can add one in. So under repository, there should be an option to add a remote. Might be under settings. I'm very used to using fork, so it changes. But the repository settings, I can go and add remote name, can tell it the path. Oops. That's origin is what we would call that. Paste in the URL. Can see that it's using GitHub. Can already tell it which account to be using, so that's fine. And go OK. Now, what I can do is I can push that change. I want to just push it to the master branch. Don't actually need to do that, but push it to the master branch. That will think about it. If you haven't used this for a little bit, it might ask for credentials. That is one thing that why I switched actually from SourceTree to Fork, is that the credential stuff is a little bit more reliable, I find, in Fork. So now if I refresh this, I can see my project is here. And if I then go and make a change, so I'll load that project back up again, and I'll go and add in some code, maybe modify the scene. So let's add a cube in. Let's create a script. We'll just leave it with a default name like that. I'll save everything and close this. And then when I come back to SourceTree, I should see there are unstaged files, and I can see a new script got added, new project settings, and I can see the actual information here for it. Our scene changed, and I can actually see what the differences are. So this can be really handy to actually check what the differences are there. And again, I can go through this process of creating a description for this and staging those files. When you are putting in a description for your change, I recommend bullet points. I recommend keeping it as short, descriptive sentences. What does this change add? What is the purpose of it, essentially? So, in this case, demonstrate simple commit, added new script, and cube to scene. So if you're finding your commit messages, you are writing pages and pages, then your commit is too large. You should be breaking it up into small regular commits. If you find that that's the case, just be splitting it up. Keep those commit messages short, to the point, and covering what does this change actually do. So I can stage all of those, and then I can commit that. But again, I can see that this change is not up on the server, so I have to actually push that change. It's asking me again. It's very annoying asking me every time for the authentication. But okay, so that's good. So we can make our changes. We can make sure we push them up. To always make sure that you are, if you're using Git, that you are pushing those changes. Very easy to forget. Not so great if you do forget, because then your changes are not there for other people. So you want to make sure that you're actually always pushing those. But what if you're wanting to be someone else working on this repository? So generally, if you're on the server, there'll usually be some option for, it's often referred to as cloning. So there's a URL that you can grab, and then in your particular tool, you can usually add in a new tab, and I can say, I want to clone. Here's the URL. I'm going to put this into a completely different folder. And I'm going to call this copy 2, like that. So I'll have 2 versions of this. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to make a change to this first version, and then we'll see how that actually looks. So we'll see how that appears and how we get that change down. So I'm just going to modify this script, and I'll make it a really straightforward modification of, I'm just going to put in serialized field float speed, like that. Now, because I've only changed code and I've made sure I've saved everything, what I can do is if I go to my version control, I'll be able to see there's a change. And the tools will usually show you the diff, like I said before, which is really handy. So I can stage all of that, and I'll commit that change. So add test line of code. I commit that. Now I can push that change. Do the authentication. Now that change is in the version of this in one folder, but I have a different folder here. And we can see its history is different. It doesn't have that change yet. So what I do, and this is how Git refers to it, I do a fetch. And fetch essentially gets the info of further changes that are there. It doesn't pull those changes in, but it gets the details of them. So I can see, here's the change I'm currently on, and there's these changes that have gone ahead. If I then want to update so that I have those changes, then in Git, I would do a pull. And now I have that change. So both of these are at the same point. So that process of committing changes, pushing them, and then for others fetching and then pulling them down, that process and the particular terms there are very specific to Git. If you were doing something like Perforce, you would be committing the change and it immediately goes up to the server. And then when you sync, it grabs it immediately from the server and applies it. Part of that is because something like of Git is what's referred to as a distributed version control system. So we can do committing, branching, all of our repository actions locally, and then we can push up that whole state essentially to, or part of it, to the server. Whereas things like of Perforce are centralized systems. So when you send up a change, when you commit a change, that goes to the server every single time. So that's the difference there between the two ways of those working. Now, once we've made changes like that, if we're wanting to review them, we can review them here on our website. We can review them in our tools like SourceTree and everything. So I can see my commits here, and I can see, okay, well, I added a line of code, and I can see the details for that. If I wanted to look at something that's a little bit more complicated and does have some automation that happens, this AI behaviors package, if I look at the commits for it, it has a lot more ones that are sitting here. And this actually, you can see there's some automation that always runs after I actually do a set of commits. And that actually packages up the Unity package for it. So things like if GitHub and that can make it really easy with using version control and with that automation to automatically produce things like packages, because that's what happens here. I have two branches. So when we're working with our code, we usually have one branch that we're working in, but then we can split off things into other branches. So in my case, my master branch, if I look at the layout, my master branch looks like this. The automation actually generates this UPM branch, which is a very different layout. And that's because the automation is structuring things so that it can just be used in the Unity package manager. So very easy to set up automations for tools like this, and it can make your life a lot easier, especially if you're someone who's working on things like Unity packages. Setting up an automation to restructure things into the necessary organization for a Unity package, really handy. You could be doing automated builds, automated testing, things like that. But it gives us a way of easily working with these and being able to review changes, merge things in. We can also do stuff like tracking bugs. So a lot of your version control tools, hosting providers for them, if you're using things like GitHub or GitLab, they'll have some issue tracking built into them. And you can usually, if I go to the closed set of ones here, there's usually integration as far as I can see, oh, okay, this was closed by this change. And that's because this change actually had text in it indicating what bug it was fixing. So again, that's just automation that can happen, makes life a lot easier. So version control is something that it just makes all of our lives easier, and it means that you don't run into issues with losing work. It facilitates you having good processes. Now, this has really just been a very, very early introductory look at it. The idea here is just to be able to get you hopefully sold on the idea of using version control, to get you so that you know some of the tools that are available. I will put links to those in the description below. And also to give you a bit of an idea of processes there as far as frequent commits, small commits, having clear messages for them, getting all of those things so that you make your life easier and so that you really sort of encourage good workflows there. So there's a lot more that could be covered here. In terms of the specific tools, I said I'll link to those in the description, and I would recommend those all have guidance on how to work with those specifically. So whatever tool you choose, there will be specific guidance for that. This, I really just wanted to sell version control and hopefully get you a little bit started on being able to be working with it. So please make sure you're using version control for any of your own projects. It will make your life much, much easier, especially if you are working with a team of folk. But even for a solo dev, it will make your life so much easier. And just because you're using version control doesn't mean you shouldn't do backups. So please make sure you also do regular backups. Thanks, folks. Hope you found the video interesting and helpful. If you have, check out a like and subscribe. It really helps out. It's really appreciated. If you have any questions, chuck those in a comment below. And if you're looking for other ways to support the channel, then I do have a Patreon, or there's also YouTube. Thanks are available there as well. But until next time, bye.